JWT stands for JSON Web Token, which holds payload data that asserts a number of claims. JWTs can be used for security as part of the OAuth client credentials flow. The server validates the client credentials using basic authentication and generates an access token in the form of a JWT. From there, it can be used for authentication for other API endpoints by adding it to the authorization header as a bearer token. We'll show you how to add JWT authentication to an ASP.NET Core Web API and how to test it. Learn Blazor WebAssembly with our 3-part online course series, as well as other .NET courses at roundthecode.com/courses. Before watching this video, make sure you watch our video on adding basic authentication to ASP.NET Core. Basic authentication is the first part of the OAuth client credentials flow, and this video will follow on from it. There is a link in the YouTube video description, or you can watch it and subscribe at youtube.com/@roundthecode. So we have two projects in our Visual Studio solution. We've got the roundthecode.jwtbearer.web API, which is an ASP.NET Core Web API. Within that, we've got an assembly called roundthecode.basicauthentication.shared. This contains the functionality for adding basic authentication. We've also got a class library here called roundthecode.jwtbearer.shared. Unlike basic authentication, JWT has its own middleware that we can add into our ASP.NET Core Web API. To do that, we need to add a NuGet package. So we go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. Do a search for JWT Bearer, and we're looking for the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.authentication.jwt Bearer package. Install it onto the ASP.NET Core Web API. We want to add some claims to the JWT when generating an access token. These claims will be the same regardless of when we generate the token, so it makes sense to add them into the app settings. So we go into app settings.json and we're going to make a new section called JWT Bearer. Within that, we're going to include the issuer, which we'll name as round the code, the audience. We're going to put the host where we're running it from, which is localhost :9904. And we're going to have a random signing key. So we're just going to insert some random letters and numbers here. After that, we want to bind it to a settings class. So we create some new folders first. Create authentication. We're also going to create JWT Bearer. Within that, we're going to create a new class, and we're going to name it JWT Bearer Settings. Within that, we're going to create 3 properties, one for the issuer, and also one for the audience, and one for the signing key. Finally, we go into our program.cs file in our ASP.NET Core Web API, and we bind it and add it to the IOC container. In order to do that, we call builder.services.addOptions. We have the class that we just created. Then we bind it to the section that is JWT Bearer. And if we had any data annotations, like if we required some fields, we can also call the validate data annotations extension method. We want to configure JWT Bearer in our ASP.NET Core Web API. First thing we want to do is we want to set some default options. We want to make sure they're set to JWT Bearer. The goal of this is that when we create a new endpoint in a controller, we want it to default to the JWT Bearer authentication. To do that, we add some options into the add authentication extension method, and we go options.defaultChallengeScheme equals JWT Bearers defaults dot authentication scheme. which is a constant string of the value of bearer. We're also going to repeat that for the authentication, the default authentication scheme. From there, we need to add a new scheme. So we've already got our basic authentication. We now need to add a scheme for our JWT Bearer. So we do that, add scheme, JWT Bearer options as the first generic type, and JWT Bearer handler as the second. From there, we set the default authentication scheme, and then we need to set some options. First, we need to get the app settings for the JWT Bearer settings that we just set up. So in order to do that, we can call builder.configuration.getSection JWT Bearer. That's the section that it is in the app settings.json file. And we call get, and we pass in our JWT Bearer settings type. If it's null, we throw a null reference exception. From there, we can set some options for our JWT Bearer scheme. We'll go ahead and we'll save the token, and we can set some token validation parameters. For that, we create a new instance. We can set the valid issuer, which we'll get from the settings. We can also set the audience, again from the settings, and also the issuer signing key. So we need to set up a new security key. And get the bytes from the JWT Bearer settings.signing key. A couple of other settings that we wish to set. We wish to set the clock skew for timespan.0. And we also wish to validate the issuer, the audience, and also the signing key. Now by default, if we haven't set any authentication for our controller endpoints, we require authorization. So we can set the require authorization extension method, and that will default to the default scheme, which in this instance is going to be the JWT Bearer's authentication scheme. Like with basic authentication, we wish to add JWT to our Swagger documentation so we can add a bearer token when executing an API endpoint. So it makes sense to copy and paste what we did to basic, and we can change some of the settings. So we can set the name to the JWT Bearer defaults.authentication scheme, and there's a couple of instances that we can change for that. Happy with the name of authorization, the type, which is HTTP, the scheme, which we've just changed. We're going to be adding it as a header. We want to add a new property in here. We want to add bearer format as JWT. Update the description. So it's JWT authorization header. And lastly, when adding the authorization header to the request, we want to add bearer before the token. When authenticating a client using JWT, we wish to set some settings. Now in order to do that, we're going to add a new class. which we're going to name JWT Bearer Client. I'm going to inherit the identity interface, and this requires some properties. So we need to set the authentication type, the is authenticated, and the name. With the configuration set up, we now want to generate a token. We do that in our OAuth controller. The first thing we need to do is we need to bring in the settings from the IOC container. So we pass in the IO options interface with a generic type of JWT Bearer settings. And we'll name it JWT Bearer settings options. We'll bring in the types for that. And we'll set it in a read-only private field of JWT Bearer settings. And set the instance to that. We call JWT Bearer settings options. .value. Next, we want to specify what it consumes the token endpoint. It's going to consume the application /x-www-form-URL encoded. Now we want to generate a token, and one of the form fields that we need to include is the grant type. So we call the from form attribute with a name of grant underscore type, which is going to be a string with a name of grant type. Now, because we're using the OAuth client credentials flow, this needs to be client underscore credentials. Otherwise, it needs to throw a bad request response. So we say if grant type is not client underscore credentials, return a bad request response. We can set the error to invalid grant and an error description stating the grant type must be set as client underscore credentials. Assuming it is set as client credentials, we can go ahead and generate the JWT token. So we need to create a new JWT security token handler. We get the current time in UTC, and we want to set the expiry. So that's going to be an hour from now. So we set add time span from hours as 1. We're going to create a new instance of our JWT Bearer client, stating that it's authenticated. Default the authentication type as JWT Bearer's defaults, .authentication scheme, and the name as round the code. With that set up, we can now write the token. We call our token handler for that, and the write token method. In that, we call token handler.createToken and create a new security token descriptor. Subject is a new claims identity with our authentic client. And at this point, we can add some claims. So we create a new instance of list claims. Within that, we can set a new claim. So we've got a number of claims that we could use here. We're going to set one as name. And it's going to be set as round the code. We need to bring in the instance of the claims, or the claim. We set when the token expires. The issuer, which we can get from the settings in the app settings.json file. Same for the audience. Sign-in credentials, this is where we get the sign-in key. In order to set this up, we need to set a new instance of sign-in credentials. Within that, it's a new security key that we need. And this will get the bytes from our sign-in key. And we use the Hamak SHA-512 security algorithm. Finally, we need to set the time it was issued. And also the not before time, which will be set to now. With the token generated, we need to return it. So we provide the access token as token. The token type as JWT Bearer, defaults.authentication scheme, which is the word bearer, and the number of seconds that it expires in. So that will be expiry.subtract, date time UTC now. We get the total seconds and convert it to a string. We want to be able to test our bearer token. To do that, we're going to go ahead and create a new API controller. So you go to Add Controller, select API, and API controller -empty. Name it Test Controller. Within that, we're going to create a new endpoint, which we're going to call Test. We're going to return a 200 response with a parameter of test equals true. It's going to be HTTP GET with a root of test. With our web API running, we wish to generate an access token using Swagger. The token endpoint has the basic authorization attribute assigned to it. That means it requires basic authentication to execute. So to do that, we set the username as round the code and the password as round the code. And we need to set the grant underscore type as client underscore credentials. Executing that generates the access token along with the token type and the number of seconds that it expires in. Now to test this out, if we were to do this without adding any authentication to it, it will return a 401 error response. The reason for that is the map controllers has a require authorization extension method assigned to it. This means that it looks at the default challenge and authenticate scheme, and it sees that that's set to jwtbearers.authenticate.scheme. So we need to go ahead and add our bearer token to this endpoint. So we've copied the access token, we're going to paste it in here, execute it, And we can see now that it's returning a 200 response with the tests field set to true. To decode a JWT, we can go to jwt.io and paste the token into the debugger. It gives us information like the algorithm and the type, as well as some payload data, like the not valid before, the expiry, the issued at, the issuer, and the audience. We can also go ahead and we can verify the signature, just to make sure that it's the right key. To download the code sample used in this tutorial, go to roundthecode.com/.net-samples. You'll get the ASP.NET Core Web API, which includes the JWT configuration and the functionality to generate a token. In addition, you'll be able to test it using Swagger. Thanks very much for watching and hit a like on the video.